recognise this talk because I'll be presenting similar to what we spoke about around the CDR presentations.
I think just keeping the mic away from that.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Maybe I'll stand back a little bit, but it's keeping you awake at least anyway. So I'll start by just one of the comments that was in the CDR roadmap, which I think is really critical to understand the opportunity that presents itself in Australia. So it says this: Australia is uniquely positioned for the large-scale deployment of novel CDR. Abundant land and mineral resources allow for biomass cultivation, enhanced rock weathering at scale. Stable geological formations and one of the largest marine estates in the world provide high capability, durable storage on both land and sea. Vast renewable potential that can power energy intensive processes such as direct air capture and ocean alkalinity enhancement, also coupled with a highly skilled workforce, provide the opportunity for us to use CDR to our advantage. But the focus of the roadmap was around understanding what we could do around novel CDR. And there were 4 technologies that we looked at in particular, and those are the ones that are really ready to deploy at scale. So direct air capture and storage, enhanced rock weathering, biomass carbon and removal, and ocean alkalinity enhancement. Oops. There we are. It's important to understand the context setting that we've got there. So recently the NDCs were announced for Australia, where we're targeting a 62 to 70% reduction by 2035. And in those, there was also in that net zero plan, there was sectoral plans as well. Those sectoral plans also include the ability for us to have net carbon removal. And as Nico mentioned, it's critical for us to meet our targets as well. It allows us the opportunity through technology development and through some innovation to also look at further enhancing our ability to store carbon in novel manners. And there was also an announcement of $52 million of carbon capturing technology research and development that was part of the plan that was recently launched. As Nico mentioned, for us to reach net zero, the CDR is part of the plan, and for every year that we are now going ahead, we need to see conventional and novel CDR as part of our removal process. So the projections that we've got essentially see us every year from now on having conventional CDR, and then over time as the technology develops, converting to more novel CDR as a way of approaching it. There's some advantage for that. It takes away some of the opportunities we have or some of the risks that we mentioned around permanency. We also see the potential for some saturation in some of the conventional CDR. It also takes away some of the challenges we might have around competing land uses and any of the issues that we have around conventional CDR, where we see issues around climate change, extreme weather events having an impact on permanency. So we see novel CDR being critical to our plans, and the 133 to 200 megatons is part of the proposal that we need to get in there that you again also mentioned in the introduction. CSIRO, in combination with a number of state governments as well as other private sector, released the plan last week in Australia, and we spoke to it in the one of the CDR roadmap launches earlier last week, I think it was. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to the actual very long report. It's very detailed. I would commend that you spend some time reading it, but if you don't have a lot of time, the executive summary is really impressive as well, and it is worth having a read. I do feel like I'm super. How's that? Is that? I'll try not to move. Bit closer to the mouth? Okay, thank you. What's important is this map here. So those 4 technologies, what we looked at was what was the prospectivity of those in the different locations. So Australia was split up into these little hexagons, and each of the technologies was looked at as what's the prospectivity of this being deployed in these locations. It looked at what some of the limiting factors were in deployment, and it also looked at some of the places across the country where we currently have projects. If you can see these little circles there, they're current or proposed propositions for CDR at the moment. When you combine those 4 technologies together, you get a prospectivity map that looks like this. There is significant prospectivity in Australia, which would mean that we can store well above what's required for us to meet our net zero targets. In an ambitious outlook, we can store and increase that storage up to 900 megatons, and we don't need anything near that. In the future, that gives you opportunities for additional storage above and beyond net zero, so you can go into a greater proportion of removal. We only identified the novel CDR capabilities that we currently believe would be prospective. So there are other CDR technologies that weren't put into this map, which mean that you may have other enhancements. But it's sensible in a sense about where you would see this. The ocean alkalinity prospectivity is near the ocean, so it's not in the desert. The geological storage is in locations where you would have stable geological storage, and the enhanced earth weathering, those sorts of things, look at locations near where you would spread that, but also access to the materials that you would require within a reasonable limit that would make it commercially viable to use that. We also see that there's still need for R&D, but also R&D around the way that you would actually get this on the ground. So it isn't just R&D to continue to deploy it, but it's about R&D about the deployment that we see as being important. And so for CSIRO and other partners in this area, we see these being the next step of us to move from a roadmap to implementation. There's 4 areas in particular that I think are important. One is around building the strong evidence, the science base, which allows us to improve the measurement, reporting and verification process. One of the other areas in particular is around fostering social acceptance and awareness. If you think back to that map, that's locations where things are already happening and where people already live. So what's the work we can do that will allow us to improve the social acceptance of these technologies and dispel some of the myths that might be around about them as well? Extremely importantly as well is around our engagement with our partners and also our First Nations people in these areas again. So these lands are owned by First Nations people in a lot of instances, and so how do we engage those into these markets as well? And I think that's the wrap up. So it probably takes us to the panel session, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Chilcott. You can find a seat up here, and I'll invite our additional panels to come up. Yeah, you can come on up. So, sure. This turns on at the bottom. Okay, thank you, Dr. Chilcott. That was a great presentation. I feel like our audience has a better understanding of the roadmap and some of the value it can deliver. As you highlighted, it's not a policy document. However, it can help to inform policy in Australia. So I think this is a really exciting way for Australia to understand the role that CDR could play in meeting some of its net zero targets, as well as meeting global climate targets. So I'd like to start by briefly introducing our panelists. We have Kushla Munro. Please correct me if I mispronounce anything.
It's Kushla, but I'm not sensitive, so it's all good. Thank you.
Okay, Kushla. She's a Deputy Secretary for Climate Change at the Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water, or DECU. And we also have Chris Neidl on stage. Hello, Chris. Chris is the Carbon Removal Lead and Climate High-Level Champion at the UNFCCC. Chris is also leading the CDR, helping to lead the CDR 30 Pavilion with our friend Chris Sherwood in the audience. For the first time, CDR has a pavilion at COP, so really exciting. Thank you all for joining this morning. First, I'd like to kick things off by just asking Kushla, what were the reasons behind Australia's commitment to this CDR roadmap?
Thanks, Nico, and great to be on the panel with CDR enthusiasts. Fantastic. So, as Chris was outlining, Australia just released its net zero map. Don't really need the points, but I probably should have them in front of me. Sorry, our net zero plan and the 6 sectoral plans. What we did, we had really detailed advice from the Climate Change Authority. So that's our independent advisory committee to the government. And they actually did really good work in terms of the sectoral pathways. CSIRO was also actually involved in a lot of that modelling. And so there's obviously a lot of discussion, and as there should be, about what we have to do immediately. And we have technologies that are absolutely ripe right now in terms of what we need to do to electrify, increase energy efficiency, start to really bend the curve on some of the low-hanging fruit in the industrial emissions. But Australia's net zero plan identifies that, this is putting the net in net zero. So there is still going to be residual emissions, and we need to be able to scale up and address that to 2050. So a lot of focus, obviously, on the interim targets 2030, 2035, but this sort of work is absolutely fundamental. So Australia's been involved in a lot of international research collaborations, including under Mission Innovation. And CSIRO, actually, from that perspective, we got a little bit more closely involved with some of their leads in terms of what was happening internationally. We could really see the need for this roadmap, and we're absolutely happy to support it, both from, we can see the policy need, but also to help fund it. So that's why we're there, because we need it.
Thank you, Kushla. Great. Chris, I wanted to turn it over to you to hear about if you have insights into what maybe other countries are doing regarding carbon dioxide removal and how we might learn from their expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I would like to just say it's really commend what Australia has done here with this roadmap. This is how you correctly do a roadmap. One thing we've learned is that the whole notion of carbon removal and any ambition does not thrive in the abstract. And so when you just look at the giant, I guess we need to do carbon removal now type of framework, that's a little too big for people to digest. And the way that it becomes conceivable and doable and the basis for action is when you look at it very closely, you ground it in science, and you relate carbon removal to what your country or context is actually like. So I think it would be a disservice if a policy document had preceded what this roadmap does, because it gets very, very specific on what the potential is. It really looks at what we're talking about here and what we can do. And it sets up policy making so that the result is not just we commit to it, but it gives policymakers very, very specific things to look at in agriculture and mining and energy and land management that it can really take and run with. So I just want to really note that. It's really sort of a top-of-class document that was highly anticipated to be really rapid, because the good news is there's a lot of things happening on CDR on the national level, and categorically you can sort of sort that by just first acknowledging that we have not only a problem, but we have a solution. And so we've had those for a number of years of countries finally being able to talk about it out loud, that they know that they have to do it. I think Finland a few years ago, very impressively, was the first country to actually put in law net negativity, that was the goal. All of the Nordic states have been right at the front of the sort of pack, really, of taking this very, very seriously, both with policy commitments. The United Kingdom and Switzerland, I would say, have really moved forward in really important ways of integrating and creating real policies. The UK and Brazil, I believe, are still alone of actually incorporating carbon removal or signaling a commitment to within their ETS systems. You have in Canada included in their NDCs and already specific policy commitments around carbon dioxide removal. The United States, as we know, has obviously gone through a massive transition politically recently. But what it did under the prior administration was significant, and I think really catalyzed a lot, and key pieces still do exist with tax credits. We're seeing in Asia, between Singapore and some of the Gulf states, really interesting roles that are starting to be played in commitments. And I think in Africa, really interesting signals from East Africa, particularly Kenya, as well as in South Africa, that they intend to do carbon removal there. And we have to include, I'm sure I've missed some country, well, Germany also is really started to jump into this with both feet. But Brazil, I think Brazil is really, really overlooked. It was the very first country to legally include carbon dioxide removal into its ETS. And being here this week, and you see how sophisticated in agriculture and mining and various different sectors, it's really starting to mobilize. So we're seeing a critical mass globally here of countries that are moving, and that's normalizing the whole project globally for more ambition from other countries.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. One thing I hear a lot in the CDR space, and I think it's true, is that different CDR pathways are going to be more appropriate for different geographies and different countries. And that's what makes Australia so exciting, is the abundance of different natural resources that can be leveraged for CDR, as well as abundance of renewable energy. I think what Chris was speaking about in the international space is a nice segue into thinking about collaboration. So I wanted to pitch a question to the entire panel, if you'd like to speak to it. What kinds of collaboration would be required to scale CDR in Australia? You might speak about international multilateral collaboration or the kinds of groups that need to be brought together within Australia to make these projects successful.
To territories.
I just talked
that
a
have
blue streak
thrived
for about 10 minutes there, so if you guys want to... Okay.
hundreds of years.
I mean, I think it's right there in the report,
in a
too, in the
healthy
policy
manner.
recommendations part. You actually
Right,
consider... oh, you want to
that
go first?
is mutually
You
dependent,
actually,
codependent
you know,
on each other.
they talk about things. How do we
Tenure,
get buy-in
I
and
say it's
interest
a
from
cloud
farmers? How do we get
because
buy-in and interest from
it's
industry?
the one that
That's absolutely critical, because CDR will live and die and
continues to
grow
protect
by the degree to
people
which
that
it's
have been
embedded
protecting
in
planet
things that already exist
in
and adds value
territory.
to it. So the Australians
Because
probably
more and
benefiting from
more
prior work
outsiders
from other
have come in
countries,
to
they
territory
understand that.
and
So
disrupt
that's a
the
really important way
balance
to look at it.
that we have talked
Globally,
about,
we
the
also have
very
really,
important
really
balance
exciting, later
of
on today,
taking
the
and
group of
giving back
negative
from
emitters,
nature.
which was
And
kicked
taking
off
and
by
giving back
Finland,
is a clear
Denmark,
element
and Panama,
of
and now has
planetary
8
health.
members. They're having a
Yeah.
ministerial at
So,
5:30 or 3:30. I'm speaking on it, so I should
In
probably
the
3:30, I
process,
think.
in
but you're
tenure-
starting to
tenure
see these
facility,
global
we
collaboratives of
concentrate on
countries that are
channeling
coming
resources
together and saying,
so
nope, not net
communities
zero,
can
net negative.
take
And it's
this
importantly from the get-go,
work
they
of
are,
measuring and
it's
remeasuring
global.
and
It's
remembering
north-south.
practices in
You have the
territory
Clean Energy
such that
Ministerial
they can
Mission
put it on
Innovation
piece
Mission
of
on
paper
CDR,
and
which I
tell
think is
government,
11
"Stop.
different countries, includes both
You
carbon
can't
management
come
and
without
CDR.
our
Just on
consent,
Saturday,
without
launched
the
here at COP
well-being
was the Global
that is
Carbon Harvest
primary,
Coalition, which I'd love to
bringing the
talk
well-being is
further
primary
with,
to our
with
territory.
Australian colleagues
So the
on.
plus, the
That's
tenure
Brazil,
plus there
Kenya,
really
and
is
India
when
getting
a
together
communities
to
measure,
accelerate ag-based
territory,
CDR. So
there's a lot of
you're
things
starting
that
to see
happen.
that, and then on the
It's not just
subnational level,
about
cities are becoming a very
measuring
fertile
boundaries and,
sort of
saying, "We are
echelon
good,
for
we're good."
action,
It's about
which is really,
remembering
really exciting.
practices.
So there's
It's
a lot of
looking
different things to
at,
collaborate on, and I
the
think
entire land and
Australia is well
its
positioned to jump
condition,
in.
Its calling spirit, and that's really the most important. I'm very happy every time I'm with Pawanka.
So adding
I'm
to
very
that, there's a
happy
couple of
with
things that
this-
I've picked up
this
while I've
calling-
been here. One has
calling
been,
spirit in
we
space.
haven't had as much focus on
The
cities, and I
calling of
think seeing
spirit,
some of the innovations
it's not
around
woo-woo,
work, and I think it
you know,
was
the people kind of think
in
that, oh,
Helsinki.
that's kind of, really kind of hippie.
Helsinki,
No,
where they're
I
talking
was
about
brought up
embodied
calling
carbon
spirit.
in their
And I
grey
have seen how
infrastructure. I think
spirit
that's an
works
area for
through
us
people.
in the innovation
So
that we
when
would be
call
very
spirit
keen
of
to
nature,
engage in.
it reminds
For us, it's
where
around the
water
de-risking.
is,
So the first movers,
how water
particularly,
can be
what do we do
protected,
as an innovation
and what
agency to
relationships
support
have
that?
been over
And the
time,
monitoring, reporting, and
where the
verification, clearly we
totems
think in the
are
standards around that is an area where we can have a role, and we think
And the
internationally
totems are very
we would be,
important for
clearly it would make a lot of
territory.
sense
We
to
all know
collaborate with
this.
that as well.
The totems of protection,
And
the totems of
I
ancestry,
often
the
look at
totems
this
of
and think
life
that these are
are
places. So how do
reconstructed in
you
that
get
process
the
of
social license to
measuring
operate?
territory.
How do you get responsible innovation in these
Government,
locations, and how do you
this is
build
where
off
we
that
are,
to look at
and
what the
this is our,
co-benefits of doing this are? And for us
this
also
is the
looking at what some of
policy
the
that protects this.
unintended potential consequences of doing this might be
so
in these
this,
locations.
I
In
will
particular,
negotiate it with
we've
you.
seen in the past
So the plus
poorly
is
thought
the
through planning can
remembering,
end up in
plus
conflicts
is
that didn't
the,
have to happen.
recollecting,
So what do you do in terms of getting engaging with the
re-
communities
valuing,
around the land use planning, as
the-
well as looking
the
at the
land
technology
and what it
deployment?
gives,
And that
and
for us
what
is
we
rich,
can give back
an
to the
area for
land.
innovation where I think we
And
can
I
learn
think
a lot
that's really
from the
where,
international experiences as
sometimes
well.
we don't describe this.
I think this has been sort of really well covered in terms of the various international forums that are around. But just the one point that I'd pick up, and so I'm from the policy side, not the science side in the Australian government. But I think Chris Needle's point from earlier about, well, how do you think about what's actually happening, what's possible internationally? And that sort of spurs on, and I think kind of normalizes what this is. Because sort of an elephant in the room is how you're talking about CCS, and this is just a continuation of coal. Like this is sort of something that's almost in the rear view mirror, but not quite in terms of the social acceptance, understanding of what it is. And I think that is why it's great. Both the CDR roadmap that CSIRO has put out, incredibly well trusted, but sort of convening the right partners to move this along with industry. And in Australia, so sort of have good opportunity in my role to visit various parts of Australia, and you sort of see it with, for example, we have a big ammonia producer up in the Pilbara. they're sort of owned by Norway effectively. We know how much Norway has invested in the various technologies, and it's kind of like, without it being government policy, it's the company's policy about how they're going to do this and pursue it. So I do think about having those enabling frameworks, supporting the science, and then that industry overlay, because all these companies have the net zero commitments as well. I think that's the other part of some of this international collaboration that we'll see coming through.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned CCS and some of the misunderstandings and misinformation around CDR. There's a lot of conflation of carbon dioxide removal with carbon capture and storage. They're not the same thing. However, carbon capture and storage, or CCS, can be part of CDR. The key differences are that CO2 for CDR must come directly from the atmosphere and that it must be stored durably. I think in both cases it's going to be stored durably. But thank you for bringing that up. And both of you, Dr. Chris Chilcutt and Kushla, you mentioned social acceptance, and that's a big topic in the CDR space. Is how can we learn from the legacies of the oil and gas industry and just industry writ large, and the way that it interacts with communities to ensure that we're doing it better, and that we're finding ways to meaningfully engage communities in both the research and the potential deployment of some of these pathways. So I wondered if you all might want to speak to the importance of social acceptability and social license in deploying carbon dioxide removal, either globally or in Australia. And perhaps if there's local context or best practices that are specific to Australia, we'd love to hear about that. Maybe Chris Neidl, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think with social acceptance, it kind of relates back to what I was talking about before about how, big, undifferentiated, giant numbers and scary graphs at a global level are not the sort of keys to ambition. They're also not the keys to social acceptance, right? And so I think to a degree we're dealing with the medium is the message when you talk about CDR. If you want people to accept it, specificity is key. You have to say, okay, this is where you're talking to people in the farming community or whatever, talk about the applications that relate to them, and that does the heavy lifting or work of getting people to buy into the broader enterprise of why we need to do carbon dioxide removal. To me, I think so much of carbon dioxide removal is inherently socially acceptable. And I'm highly biased. I've been in CDR for a while. But it's just very interesting, co-beneficial, doable, exciting types of solutions. And we can't back-end that to the bigger, we need to do 10 gigatons by 2050. That's tempting to do that, to raise the alarms around urgency. But the key is to show people the work and what can actually be done. And again, I commend the Australians because I think the paper lends itself to that, both in terms of how it flows into future policy, but how it flows into future messaging about what we're actually talking about.
Yeah, look, it's hard to, I'll add to that. So when I was preparing for this, I asked the team, what's the physical manifestation of this? What does it actually look like? So if I'm trying to explain it to someone using the acronyms and the roadmap and the maps gets context, but if someone says, but what actually is it? And the other day, MCI Carbon, one of the companies in Australia who are doing this, had a block. And they said, this is it. This is what it actually looks like. So I think the challenge in communication, we use acronyms a lot when we do this, CDR, CCS, CSU, and all the other things around that. The transfer of that information will require us to look at the way we do that better, and in a way that it actually will physically manifest in these regions and in those locations, and for people on their businesses. So if you're a farmer, you're thinking about enhanced rock weathering, what does that look like? What implications might that have for your enterprise? And what are the benefits that you might get from that? And how do you manage any of the risks that you might have as well? And we've seen in some areas, what does your neighbour think is as important as the impacts on your farm? So how do you bring your neighbours along in some of those discussions as well?
If I could add to that, I was a solar guy once upon a time, and the distributedness of that, it's an adopted solution that in aggregate has its impact. And one of the things that's really exciting about things like ERW biochar, unlike a giant plant-based solution, it has those same dynamics. You get a critical mass of early adopters, they start getting benefits from the co-benefits, and it starts to develop its own legs in a way, which is good to see that some of the solutions that you've really highlighted have that kind of, those properties.
I also think in the Australian context, you know, people don't necessarily trust the government. They don't necessarily trust those private sector companies that are trying to do X or Y. But they actually, like CSIRO is actually one of our most respected organisations. And so sort of well understood, worked with communities many years and had really good social science programs and connections and understand that. And so I think other Chris's point, absolutely, you know, like don't try to scare and we say have to do this. It's actually doing the work with communities because you can push really hard and you'll go back. But if you work with and bring people along, I think that's really significant. I also think that there's a different, you know, responsibility as well with First Nations people in terms of their land, their oceans, the impacts, and that's a harder one. And again, I think, but it starts from the point of acknowledging and working respectfully with all communities.
If I could, 10 seconds. First Nations part, that's a really interesting one that you mentioned. In North America, there's real leadership and excitement among First Nations communities around a whole host of these. So we also shouldn't presume that we have to make a real hard sell. You have to be very clear what you're talking about. But on the collaboration front, I think the stuff that's happening in North America around these conversations and how do we give capacity to First Nations so they get value out of that. And somebody's not just knocking on their door and say, hey, we want to do this giant thing. They've been there before. It would be good if we could figure out a way to connect Indigenous groups in various parts of the world, not just in their own respective regions.
Thanks, everyone. Hearing you all talk about the different ways we can engage communities makes me think about the frameworks for environmental justice. On the one hand, you have more procedural justice, which you describe as sort of this paradigm of early and often. So it's engaging in the planning phase, perhaps providing some level of education to ensure that you're engaging on a level playing field and that folks in which that live in these communities where carbon removal may be deployed or distributed have the opportunity to engage meaningfully. And then you have more distributive justice, which Chris Neidl alluded to through the co-benefits. How are we ensuring that the benefits that are delivered through carbon removal are not just delivered on the global scale to our homogeneous atmosphere, but also on the community scale? And trust that there are many co-benefits from a lot of these carbon removal pathways. So it can be quite exciting and actually an easier sell than one might think. Okay, so I would like to transition now to talking about some of the enabling factors that help to underpin a healthy and thriving carbon removal ecosystem. So I thought maybe we can start with our friends from Australia, if you might share some of the enabling factors that help for a thriving and healthy CDR ecosystem, especially if there's some that are particularly relevant to the Australia context. And in that response, you might describe what you see as critical next steps for accelerating novel CDR development, deployment in Australia. Thank you.
I'm happy to go first. I think on this front, the foundations, as we were sort of saying, absolutely critical, and that is why it's so great. We have the CDR roadmap. But just to extend that out a little bit, we still have grant funding. That's gone to, as Chris was saying, Dr. Chris was saying here, the mineral carbonisation sort of projects. Again, when you talk about what is it sort of looks like a cement block. It's very real. But also some of the direct air capture, and they've sort of been successful grantees of those projects. The other thing which I think is really interesting, and I don't know if the other Chris...
Just call me Masters of Science Chris. He'll be Dr. Chris.
Okay, Master of Science Chris and Dr. Chris here. So many doctors of Chris's here. But the international guidelines for how countries measure and account for carbon removals are still actually being developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we've got some of our experts who are leading that work. We expect that to happen by 2027. And it's sort of interesting because once those guidelines are in place, from a sort of a national perspective, we'll be able to look about how we recognise these removals under our national accounting frameworks. And in our system, that also means we sort of have mechanisms like the Australian carbon credit units. And so it's a different way to create that kind of framework, financial signal pull through for these sorts of projects. So the research development, absolutely critical, but also setting up, from the biggest picture in terms of, well, how are we really going to account for this at the international level, right through to a domestic scheme that can actually start to monetize this technology. So.
I think one of the slides we talked to, I think it's about 8 or 10 things that we think would be the next steps for us around the industry. Just re-emphasising, it was around that strong science evidence base, which you mentioned, and that's important for transparency and social acceptance. Particularly, we're keen around the engagement with First Nations people, which we mentioned before, and how you bring those into those markets. The measuring, reporting and verification was important, but I think the area that's also important is how you then start to use existing infrastructure. So what can you build on currently rather than creating new infrastructure to support this? How do you get those added advantages? And we're particularly interested in looking at the supply chains as well. So how do you overcome some of those distance constraints that we see in Australia around some of these technologies without creating other issues? So they're the areas that we see next as being important.
Yeah, I would just say the embedding of CDR is the really key way to do it. And so it doesn't look like here's this planet CDR over there. I guess we'll get to that at some point. But to frame it, not just frame it, do it in a way that it seems like an extension of other things that have standing, that already exist, that have staying power. And that applies equally to industries. It applies to policy frameworks. What do you already do in Australia, and how do you relate this to this? And it also applies to national identity and community identity. What do Australians do well? How do they define themselves? And where does that intersect with the things that carbon dioxide removal does, including being a leader on carbon dioxide removal? So I would say just making it a property of things that already exist and have forward motion rather than something separate is a key approach strategically.
Couldn't agree more. Industrial integration is one of the most exciting areas of research for carbon dioxide removal. And as Chris also alluded to in the policy space, using existing policy frameworks to deploy and draft policy for carbon removal is also one of the really exciting and ripe places for advancing this field. Also want to highlight on the topic of industrial integration, shout out to Marcus Daw and Sophia Hamblin-Wang, the co-founders of MCI Carbon. Just wonderful people and really paving the way for mineral carbonation and industrial integration in Australia through CCS and hopefully eventually CDR. One more question I wanted to ask, since we've got you here, Chris, and you've been such a champion for carbon removal at COP30. Could you speak to some of the targets that you've announced at COP30 and how maybe Australia can help to support those?
Amazingly, I left that out when you gave me the softball for that with the first question. Jesus. This was an exciting COP because it's the first time carbon dioxide removal was ever included in an action agenda, and we got not just one initiative, but two. And I mentioned the one earlier with the Global Carbon Harvest Coalition, which absolutely is relevant to Australia because it has a focus on ERW and biochar. But the other one is an initiative that we call the Carbon Removal Mutirao. And if you're familiar with that, that's one of the animating sort of principles of this COP, getting together. If you work as a group, you're more than the sum of your parts and you accelerate things. And so what we think CDR needs more than anything is really drafted right from what this COP says more generally. Writ large, we need more than anything. We can't be just focusing on the distant future and relying on 2050 scientific targets. That's not going to animate things. We need a shorter-term implementation target, and we need people who are new entrants and more experienced in the private sector, government, and industry talking and sharing. And that's going to move things forward much faster. So we look at a number of high-level targets that have already been issued for pretty high, prestigious places in recent years, around 2030. So we're looking at, let's shoot for 100 million high durability by 2030, cumulative, maybe with 30 million delivered, and then a larger amount for nature-based solutions than the 3 gigaton. And again, that kind of drafts from existing targets. But whether that target gets futzed with or changed or up or down, we need a target that is ambitious and achievable. Otherwise, we're not going to see things materialize in the way they would if we're only looking in the much distant horizon.
That's right. Thank you, Chris. I realize I didn't warn our audience here, but if there are questions that have been percolating in your mind, either about Australia specifically and how they're deploying or thinking about carbon removal, or about CDR writ large, I'd love to give the audience an opportunity to pose any questions that you might have. Great, lots of interest. Thank you, thank you.
Who was first?
Thank you. My name is Alison Galkat. I'm a journalist. I cover carbon markets. I'd like to ask about how Australia is looking at marine carbon removals. If you could elaborate on that.
That was one of the most exciting things about the report. It actually says ocean alkalinity enhancement and does the numbers. But yeah, get into it because it's really exciting and a huge opportunity for Australia. No, you're the scientist. I'm just the blabbermouth.
I was literally going to say that. So I was going to then hand to you and say, do you want to talk about it a bit more technically than I could?
No, I can't talk about it more technically than you can. I can talk about
But
it. It's huge.
Definitely in the report. It's one of the 4 areas where we see opportunity. And there's some quite specific discussions in there about how that could be deployed. It's probably...
Yeah, I can also comment a little bit because actually my background isn't more in marine CDR than any other form of CDR, and I think Australia really has potential to be one of the leaders in this space. A lot of researchers at the University of Tasmania, such as Dr. Philip Boyd, have published quite a lot. Dr. Leonard Bach as well have published quite a lot on this topic. Some of it is really just evaluating all of the scientific uncertainties that remain for marine carbon dioxide removal. And of course, as many MCDR communicators will remind you, the MCDR umbrella is a big one, and a lot of people don't like it because there's the technologies that exist under that umbrella are so different. The one that's been mapped in the roadmap is ocean alkalinity enhancement, which helps to draw down more CO2 through either mineral dispersion or through electrochemical alkalinity enhancement of the ocean. And then you've got other forms like ocean iron fertilization, which could be particularly relevant for offshore from Australia's waters because ocean iron fertilization is more relevant for the Southern Ocean and near the poles in general, as I understand it. Yeah.
I'll just put something here in the Australia Pavilion, but I mentioned, this year Brazil led the Global Carbon Harvest Coalition, which is focused on agriculture. I think Australia and the island states would be incredibly well positioned to really lead collaboratively with other countries around ocean CDR. Just saying.
Okay. Let's take one more.
Thank you very much. My name is Gitas Siwanga. I'm the head of Resilience, Livelihoods and Emergencies at ActionAid Kenya. We are implementing an ANCP project funded by DFAT in collaboration with ActionAid Australia. I have 2 questions for you regarding this very interesting topic that I have passion with. The first one is whether you think in the spirit of localization agenda, there will be role of the community, frontline community on this. What will be that role? And then the second question for me will be, does CDR address the real causes, the root causes of climate change? These are questions that have been asked many times when I go to the field in the communities. So this is good opportunity for me to learn from you experts. Thank you.
I think we sort of covered the first point, like maybe we talked about the social license, but the communities are absolutely at the core of this to answer the first part. And in terms of does it address the core of climate change? No, it's dealing with the need to draw down the CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So it's not the answer, and I think it's part of the answer. So we have to do all the things to make it safe for us to live on this planet. And so that's how I see. It's not the solution; it is part of the solution. We haven't done enough on it yet, and we need to get going because these technologies, the social acceptance, all of these issues are going to take us time to be able to accelerate it.
I should mention, too, Kenya is one of the most exciting places in the world for carbon removal now, not just because of its potential, which sometimes you look at countries, there's just geniuses on the ground, entrepreneurially, in every area. And Chief Climate Envoy for Kenya, Ali Mohammed, has been one of the most full-throated, first to the scene, champions about talking about why we need carbon removal, and they're part of the group of negative emitters. So I just want to really give a shout out to Kenya for the extraordinary stuff that's happening there.
Hey, thanks, guys. It's been an awesome tunnel. My name's Amanda. I'm from the Bank of Queensland, so a long way from home. We could cover everything from greenwashing, role of private sector, the like. But the question I've actually got is, when you talk about the demand for these projects, do you think there's a role in carbon pricing, whether it is internal carbon pricing or from a policy level?
I feel like I'm talking, this New York voice just booming through here. Sorry, there should be more Australian talking. Yeah, carbon pricing is essential. I mean, there's so many things here. We need to create the commodity of carbon removal. What is it that we're even talking about? So that involves, the monitoring, reporting, verification, standards, and pricing. Without that, we're sort of groping around in the dark, and you really can't animate a market. And I think we're seeing really good progress on that. I think there's some things that might even happen before the end of the COP in that direction. But yeah, it's a critical framework for really giving us a commodity to talk about carbon removal as an exchangeable thing, which it has to, I think, in order to scale.
I got it. One more question. Thank you, Chris.
Sorry. So Chris Sherwood from the Negative Emissions Platform. You mentioned marine carbon dioxide removals. There is a session starting in 9 minutes at the CDR Pavilion on marine carbon dioxide removals. So if you're interested in that topic, please don't hesitate to go. I just wanted to ask a question about social acceptance again. So I spoke to a lady not long ago who dropped her kids off at school in her new electric car, and was asked by other mothers and fathers dropping off their children what she thought of her electric car, and her response was not, "Oh, it's great, I'm saving so much CO2 going into the atmosphere with this vehicle." Her response was, "It drives really well, it costs me less to run," and I think that's the kind of mindset that we need. But
Totally.
How do we translate the in terms of social acceptance? How do we translate good practices into standards or rules? Is there a place for law here, or is there a place for self-regulation, or how do you see that emerging, maybe not just nationally but globally?
There has to be laws, just like there is for every other thing that we've had to do at scale. There's the sometimes hidden, unheralded role of policy, but there absolutely, whether it is something at a high level that integrates carbon removal specifically into climate strategies, or whether it's more targeted integration of carbon removals into ag policy or into industrial policy or into waste policy, you can have a sort of an ambition and theory around it, but the thing that really puts it on track are both policies that enable and affect the demand and the supply, and those should be tailored to the individual country and context into how they already do it. And I know Australia already has lots of policies in other areas. Leverage those to see how can you use that. You're not, rather than creating something from scratch. But yeah, policy is key.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's a great note to end on. We are running out of time here. But I also wanted to remind folks of some other panels that are coming up. So today at 3:30, Chris Neidl mentioned a panel at the Danish Pavilion where we'll be, it's hosted by the group of negative emitters, and we'll be talking about governance of CDR globally. And also tomorrow at the CDR 30 Pavilion, I'll be delivering an explainer with a colleague about the difference between CCS and CDR in case you'd like to dive deeper on that topic. So thank you to our panelists. This roadmap really helps to put Australia on track to be a leader in CDR and leverage some of its existing natural and community natural assets. And it also, I encourage everyone to check out the roadmap. Thank you as well to our partners who organized this at CSIRO, the Australian delegation, and just a round of applause for our remaining panelists here. Thank you. And that will conclude the session. Thanks so much.